Hello and welcome to another of PAVE's weekly virtual panel discussions. My name is Ed Niedermeyer. I am the communications director here at Partners for Automated Vehicle Education. And this week we are looking at a really important topic that I feel doesn't always get the attention that it deserves. So we've assembled a group of three really leading sort of experts in this area, and we're very excited to share all of their insights into the question of how AVs will impact workforce development. And you know, ever since automation has been a thing, this has been something that people have worried about and thought about, how that automation interacts with your ability to get a job, have a job, the kind of work that's available. So we'll try and demystify some of that and maybe even bust a few myths in the process. Joining me to help do that, we have Michael Fleming from Torc Robotics. Michael, welcome.
Ed, thank you for having me.
From Securing America's Future Energy, or SAFE, Alex Hutkin. Alex, welcome.
Thanks, Ed. Glad to be here.
And from the US Department of Labor, we have Lindsey Teel. Lindsey, welcome.
Thanks, Ed.
So I want to start on a slightly similar note. If you caught our panel last week, we sort of started off by kind of asking each of our guests to share sort of their vision for maybe like the best case scenario, right? If you can imagine a future in which we have automated vehicles and they've had the kind of positive impact that you think is possible for them to have, you know, what does that world look like? And Michael, I'll go ahead and start with you.
Okay, great. And yeah, I'll give a little bit of background on myself. I'll try to be, pretty brief here. But, I started Torc, which is a self-driving company about 15 years ago, which is before SAE defined its levels of automation, which kind of makes me sound old. Some people call it a pioneer. So I've seen a lot of different things. And, to be direct, I've thought about this every day for the last, 15 years, because this is, quite frankly, the only job I've had. When we crossed the finish line in the DARPA challenge in 2007, there was a lot of press about the potential impact of this technology. But like most disruptive technologies, it takes a long time. As I've always put it, this is a marathon, it's not a sprint. About 3 years ago, we predicted a pretty tectonic shift in the self-driving industry. The robotaxi problem is a really difficult problem, and we thought that trucking would be the next big mover for two different reasons. One, there's an incredibly strong business case. Today, there's a massive driver shortage, about 60,000 truck driver shortage. It's expected to grow to about 110,000 on average over the next decade. And we start thinking about how does that impact you and me and some of the other participants here. If we look at the amount of goods that we consume, whether it's toothpaste or food or consumer deliveries, about 70% of those are touched by a truck. So we made the decision to really dramatically shift into trucking. And at the same time, it's a little bit of an easier challenge to solve technically than robotaxi, because we're focused on interstates and highways, as opposed to all the different roads in the US. So we joined the Daimler Truck family. And if you're not familiar with Daimler Trucks, they're the market share leader within trucking. Because with most difficult problems, it's not just one organization, it's setting up the right partnerships to solve such a difficult problem. So when we look at the term displacement, we don't really see displacement taking place. Our mission and focus is to fill the current driver shortage that's expected to grow, moving forward. But also, in the long term, today, Torc employs a lot of truck drivers, and we're going to continue to employ truck drivers because the knowledge and the know-how of these experienced drivers coming in and working with our engineers to talk about some of the challenging situations that they encounter is incredibly valuable. So what I find interesting is the truck drivers of today will reinvent the trucking of the future.
That is really fascinating. And yeah, I think that's an element of automation people often overlook, is that you need to have humans who really know how to do the job that's going to be automated, and even to even do a good job or know what a good job is, right? So Lindsey, shifting to, from a private sector, company's perspective to kind of the more public sector perspective that you have with your work at the Department of Labor, sort of what is your vision for what's possible here in terms of AV's impact on the workforce?
Yes, thank you, Ed, and thanks again for having me today. So as you said, I work at the U.S. Department of Labor, Office of Disability Employment Policy. And one thing that has been identified as a barrier to employment for people with disabilities is a lack of access to good quality on-demand transportation. I can also speak to this from personal experience as a person who is visually impaired and was not able to drive. So we know that the Bureau of Transportation Statistics identified in 2018 that there's 25.5 million Americans with a travel limiting disability. And of those, half are in the working age. But of those, only about a fifth work part or full time. Now, this is data that is pre-COVID, so we don't know how that's changed just yet as a result of the last year in the pandemic. But we do know that unemployment rose last year among all workers, but especially among workers with a disability. And we need to solve these transportation problems for people with disabilities and make sure that they have equal access to getting to work. So AVs are a really exciting part of that solution. And we have been partnering with the Department of Transportation and other federal agencies to see how can we leverage transportation innovation through inclusive design so that people with disabilities can use this technology to get to work.
Absolutely. Yeah, no, I think that's such a cool example of, people don't always think about the fact that this could actually bring, people who aren't currently in the workforce into the workforce. Yeah, Alex, I know you've studied this quite a bit at SAFE. So I'm really curious to hear your thoughts, sort of just kind of looking at this whole problem from the big picture.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you, Ed. To add a little bit of context around SAFE's work, we've been involved in the AV policy, research, and advocacy space since about 2015. I've been a part of the SAFE team on the government relations side, doing advocacy work for the past couple of years after a almost decade-long stint on Capitol Hill. But over the past few years, SAFE has produced a number of reports really examining the societal benefits of autonomous vehicles, including impacts on disabled communities, on disadvantaged communities, and of course, on the workforce. On the workforce question, we were concerned by the number of sensationalistic news headlines that simply counted all driving jobs in the US economy and assumed that all of those jobs would be lost in a transition to autonomous vehicles. There was no real existing analysis at the time, and anything that was in existence really lacked context, nuance, or real grounding in labor market dynamics and the natural cycle of labor force evolution. So we commissioned this study with Dr. Erica Groshin, the former commissioner of BLS, to really dive deeply into a few questions. Really, one of the major ones was, what are some concrete examples that illustrate the nature and magnitude of the economic and social benefits of AVs? And we focused on just one of the major issues that we found was that number of people lacked access to job centers due to their concern about commuting times and distance. We found that 28% more people would be willing to travel to work if they could be a passenger rather than a driver in a vehicle. So we're looking at opening up the economy to people who might not already have access to it, and really touching on what Lindsey said. We did another study on disabled communities and found that AVs would open up work opportunities to 2 million individuals in the disabled community who are either out of the workforce or unemployed. So we see a huge number of societal impacts for communities that have not historically had access to the major parts of the economy that many of us take for granted every day. So we're really excited about the work that companies like Torc are doing to really make this technology possible. and partnering with the Department of Labor to make sure that as this AV future is unfolding, they're really being cognizant of the workforce impacts and making sure that we're preparing today's workers for the economy of the future.
Absolutely. And you brought up a really interesting point. And I think it's hard to imagine the future, right? Or predict the future. It's just intrinsically a hard thing to do. But I think, as you pointed out, it can be tempting to kind of come to, use simplistic ways of thinking about the AV impact, including, right? Like if it's a driving job, it just will definitely go away. Lindsey, I was wondering, do you have thoughts on sort of how to think about this problem a little bit more sophisticatedly, maybe how to measure better or how to understand some of these impacts better? Do you have any things that you could share to help people as they think through these things themselves, sort of think about these impacts?
Sure, Ed. So I'm going to come at this problem from a very specific perspective. At the Office of Disability Employment Policy, we are trying to improve employment outcomes for people with disabilities. And so we look at 3 specific groups of people with disabilities. That is people with physical, sensory, and cognitive disabilities. And we are looking at ways to improve transportation access for each of those groups so that they can then pursue those jobs that Alex discussed that were predicted in the SAFE report. So there may be others on this call that can weigh in more from a general labor perspective, but from our perspective at ODEP, we are looking at how to leverage automated vehicles to bridge transportation gaps that already exist and drive employment outcomes.
Yeah, and Michael, AVs right now we can learn from these early deployments, and there's a lot of pilots and other things that are being used to sort of start to understand some of these impacts. But of course, when you get to scale, you get all kinds of different things, network effects and things like that. How do you sort of think about and go about sort of understanding what the impacts of this technology will be on the workforce?
Yeah, sure. Seeing how we've been at this for about 15 years, we're one of the few companies that have actually commercialized self-driving technology in other industries. And we can kind of take those lessons learned in those smaller markets and then move those lessons over to trucking where we're focused today. The closest analogy that I can come up with in the deployment of self-driving trucks is that of the cell phone industry. So cell phones were invented about 50 years ago. And 50 years ago, we didn't have coast-to-coast coverage. Cell phone towers were established in areas that made the most amount of business sense. So probably areas that were easy to establish towers that had a strong business case. And over the last 50 years, we've had cell phone networks continue to deploy. And 50 years later, we still don't have coast-to-coast coverage. There's not 100% coverage today. I think you're going to see something similar with trucking. So Torc has been testing in the Southwest since we've joined the Daimler truck family, and we're testing Gen 2 of the trucks right now. And you're going to see the initial rollout in the Southwest corridor because it's a little bit of a simpler environment. And then we will, slowly and incrementally, scale out our self-driving truck network to more challenging and difficult, situations. As we look at the effects of scale and some of the comments you made as far as the network goes, the great thing about self-driving trucks and self-driving technology is we don't really take bathroom breaks. We really don't get fatigued. We can run trucks 24/7, or I'll call it 22/7 because, we take a couple hours to do some preventative maintenance and so forth. Today, the limiting factor in driving trucks 22 hours a day is the driver. We need to make sure the driver is well rested. There's some regulations in place to do that. So as we deploy self-driving trucks, we actually see an exponential effect on throughput. And I think we are all consumers of goods that have been shipped by a truck. And I think we as consumers want things delivered faster and cheaper. And I think that's the impact that you're going to see from an exponential standpoint. But once again, this is going to be rolled out incrementally.
Yeah. And Alex, I would like you to, the report specifically, and as you said, you've done reports on, or SAFE has been involved in reports, covering a lot of different aspects of this. But you have one that's really specific on the sort of employment and workforce and sort of economic impact of AVs. And I was hoping that you could just sort of, explain some of your main findings there, because they aren't all necessarily exactly what you might assume, right?
Right. So I'll talk first on the economic benefits and then touch on the workforce side. So on the economic benefits, we focused on AVs at full deployment around about 2050. And we really focused on two primary economic areas, both public benefits and private benefits. On the public benefit side, the lion's share of economic benefit came in the form of accident reduction, which is about $500 billion in savings per year. There are also other public benefits in terms of congestion mitigation and also just savings on the purchase of oil and gas and the dependence that our current dependence on oil and gas to power our transportation system. In terms of private benefits, found that there's a significant savings in individuals' time, with whether it be commuting or just running the day-to-day errands that it takes to run a household, that individuals would see direct benefit from this as well. So if you couple those public and private benefits together, we found that full deployment of AVs would result in about $796 billion in economic benefit per year by 2050. Then in terms of the labor market side, again, we saw all these headlines about all of these jobs will be lost. But that's just simply not accurate. You will have individuals entering the AV manufacturing space directly. AV suppliers and supply chain will create additional jobs, and also this greater access to employment in the economy will also create a benefit for individuals. You'll also still have jobs of loading and unloading on maintenance, as well as route planning and mapping and managing these AV fleets. So in terms of labor market impact, well, there will be a diversification of fields for the impacted workforce to enter into. But even with aggressive AV development over the next 30 years, displaced workers from the current transportation fleets would account for less than 1% of the overall displaced workforce. So the impact is relatively minimal, especially when you take into account the workforce development that would take place to make sure that people are transitioning into these new parts of the economy that will open up as the technology deploys.
Hey, Ed, I would love to add something to that.
Please do.
Thank you. So with these opportunities for new types of jobs, we are hopeful that people with disabilities can be some of the folks that are taking those jobs. In a changing economy, as new jobs come about, we need to be making sure that disabilities have opportunities to grab those jobs and to be successful in them. And so I would just encourage anyone who's listening, if you are an AV industry representative, if you work in this sector, I would just encourage you to hire the experts. If you want to improve your bottom line, make these vehicles work for as many people as you can. And you can start by hiring the experts, hiring people with these travel limiting disabilities to help you make the best product that's going to meet the most needs.
And
Absolutely.
if I could tag on to that, Lindsey, Alex, I think those are great comments. Think about, and it's, like I said, I've been thinking about this for 15 years and I still can't contemplate the impact that this technology is going to have. But let's think about all the jobs that are going to be created by the markets that don't exist today that AV, whether it's robotaxis or self-driving trucks, will create. And those will be significant. So if we take ourselves back to my simple analogy of the cell phone network, 50 years ago, who would have thought that cell phones would be used to order pizzas, pay taxes, and find dates today? So if we could take that same mindset and apply it to the potential industries that autonomous vehicles will end up creating, I think it's significant.
Yeah, absolutely. And for a lot of these things, right, I think sometimes when we have these discussions, it can sort of be like, you know, well, if we develop this technology, it will definitely always be this one way or this other way. And like, that's how a lot of these discussions are framed. But in reality, all technology is kind of what we make of it, right? And Alex, I know, you know, for example, last week when we discussed congestion, sort of how you deploy and use AVs could have remarkably different sort of impacts on just congestion. So not one issue. Alex, are there issues here as well where, you know, there are specific decision points around, I don't know, how we deploy these vehicles, how they're developed, who's operating them, that can have a similar kind of either very positive or very negative impact, or are there really critical decision points like that?
Yeah, I think that, you know, as companies are planning these workforce transitions, putting in place robust training and employee development programs, it's a critical piece of making sure that individual workers are not being left behind. So it's about protecting the worker, not necessarily protecting the job. You know, as new technology proliferates, there's always going to be a transition in jobs. But you know, many of the individuals in this space now they're experts in route planning. They're experts in logistics. You know, they have the innate skills that translates very well into, you know, the type of planning that is needed to actually deploy these vehicles on the roadway to, you know, limit congestion and make their routes as efficient as possible. So I think there's a huge amount of opportunity to keep employees engaged, you know, in this transition, yeah, as it moves forward.
Absolutely. And Michael, I have to get you to kind of weigh in here and just sort of describe, you mentioned, you know, you have a lot of truckers coming in to work on self-driving trucks that you're developing. What kind of, you know, sort of development work do you do with folks to kind of take, as Alex was saying, those skills that you know, were honed in actually driving the trucks and really making sure that they do get applied to the work that you're doing now? Sure.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, you know, if you look at some of the rules of the road, if you will, so if you were to get a formal education, after you complete that formal education, I wouldn't say that you're a highly experienced truck driver and you can drive a truck from an optimal standpoint, okay? That takes years of experience. And so by bringing in these experienced truck drivers, sitting down with these engineers, safety is always paramount, but we also look at optimization as well. So we've been testing on public roads since 2007. And as we start running into these different unique scenarios, safety is always number one, okay? But then we also talk to the truck drivers about how do we optimize for efficiency. A great example here, and it's a simple example, is we have these bad actors, if you will, drivers doing things that they shouldn't do. And so we ask our truck drivers, okay, when you see someone sort of swerving into your lane, what do you do? What do you think about? Walk through that thought process. And we don't just bring in one experienced truck driver, we bring in a lot of different truck drivers, and they have different experiences, and we discuss what makes the most amount of sense from an optimization standpoint. So some truck drivers will say, hey, in that situation, I will hug the right lane, the lane line, okay? Other truck drivers will say, hey, you know, we'll sort of slow down a little bit to create some separation between us and another car. We also have the issue that these trucks are about 80,000 pounds and our cars weigh far less than that. So the stopping distance between a truck and a car are very different. So that's one of the hot topics that we discussed with our truck drivers. What happens in the situation where a car cuts in front of a truck and aggressively stops? So there's part of this is art, if you will. And by bringing in those experienced truck drivers, we can kind of communicate that art with the engineers and transfer that art into software and sound decision making. Yeah, absolutely. And yeah, it seems like some of the things that
are most amazing about what humans do when they're driving are kind of subconscious. And I'm sure it takes a lot of work to kind of tease out, you know, what are those things that you're seeing, because sometimes you're just reacting and not really, you know, consciously understanding necessarily what's a good. And yeah.
Let me comment on that because it's fascinating, Ed. In part, what we're trying to do is predict what other drivers are going to do. But human nature is unpredictable. And think about driving 400 miles and the number of cars that you pass. So you're encountering thousands of people that you've never met, trying to ascertain what they're going to do. It's a fascinating problem, but there is an art to it.
Absolutely. And the greatest thing about the AV sector, hands down, in my opinion, is that everyone has to learn all the time, constantly. And Lindsey, I wanted to ask you sort of, you know, we're still very early in you know, both the technology, but also our sort of understanding and sort of embrace of it as a society. But so far, what have we learned sort of from the governmental public sector side? What have we learned about kind of what works and what doesn't work?
Great, that's a great question, Ed. So we actually at ODEP partnered with SAFE back in 2017 to launch a national online dialogue, a crowdsourcing event, to understand how do we leverage automated vehicles to drive employment for people with disabilities? So that was how we kicked off this conversation in 2017. We heard from lots of people. There was a lot of interest in the topic. And that just kind of kicked off a really interesting series of stakeholder engagement events. And the first in-person one was in May of 2018. We had a federal interagency meeting with the Department of Transportation, Department of Labor, Health and Human Services, lots of the different federal agencies to say, okay, what's everybody doing in this area, and how do we partner? How do we collaborate to make sure that our policies have this outcome of enabling people to enter the workforce that weren't able to before? And so that kind of started the federal conversation. And next, we went to the Automated Vehicle Symposium in San Francisco in 2018. And we talked to lots of people, but primarily industry representatives were there. We heard from them. And then the next listening session we had was with the disability advocacy groups, as well as some older adults advocacy groups here in DC in the fall of 2018. And then we rounded out our engagement by hosting, this is before the pandemic even, a research community virtual information gathering session where we brought together some of the university experts in this issue. And we actually put together a report with findings from these 4 listening sessions. You can find that report on dol.gov/ODEP under the transportation page. And we heard lots of interesting things. You know, people said, you know, government needs to work together on this. You need to have the users with disabilities at the table, not just in your user experience research, but you need to have them as your engineers and your designers and developers of AVs. We heard really interesting information about the rural-urban divide, that those of us who live in big cities already have pretty good access to transportation, but what about these rural areas? What about small towns? Any areas that don't have good access to public transit? How can we leverage fleets of AVs to meet transportation needs in those areas? We heard about cost. How can people who have lower incomes afford not necessarily to purchase an AV, but to pay for a ride in an AV? How do you make a business case to send a fleet of automated vehicles to a lower density rural area? And so there's all kinds of interesting things in the report. I encourage you guys to check it out. And since then, I will say I had the opportunity to go on a year-long detail to the Department of Transportation. The first half was at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, NHTSA, and then the second half was at the Office of the Secretary of Transportation for Policy, and was able to do some really interesting work on around incentivizing the industry to design for accessibility. And one of the things that came about from that is the Inclusive Design Challenge. Many of you may have heard about this. There's some great work going on. 10 teams won they are semi-finalists and have designed different components of automated vehicles that can address accessibility issues for user groups such as people with physical, sensory, or cognitive disabilities. And so we're excited to see what prototypes come out of the Inclusive Design Challenge.
Absolutely. We're huge fans of the Inclusive Design Challenge here at PAVE. We did a little webinar to help promote it. Really excited to watch that. And we have more content on that coming. So if you're interested in that, keep following us here at PAVE. Alex, we're just about out of time here, but I was wondering, can you just sort of take that and sort of look to the future and sort of what are the things that could potentially be on the policy menu, so to speak, that could help make sure we get the best possible outcome out of this?
It's a great question, Ed. Thank you. Yeah, I think in SAFE's view, there are a couple of things that we could be doing right now to help this technology further develop and mature. And that is, creating a federal framework for AV deployment, and also just getting more vehicles out there on the roadways to be tested in a safe manner so that we can continue to learn and continue to develop the technology. So there's a couple different options on the table to do that right now. First is raising the per manufacturer federal motor vehicle safety standards cap to allow more AVs to be tested on the roadway, give us more road miles, more data, which would allow AV companies to refine the technology. Second is establishing a highly automated system center of excellence at the Department of Transportation, which can really better consolidate all of these lessons learned, put together a framework, and then distribute that both across the federal government, but also down to the state level, to state departments of transportation that are also grappling with how they get more AVs out on the roadway and are testing them, of course, in a safe manner. But really, it's about consolidating those lessons learned, getting that out there so that people and decision makers have the best information, most complete information available to them, and then just simply getting more miles under our belts to make sure that the technology continues to mature and develop.
Absolutely. And here at PAVE, we also love to hear that education is an important part of this. We certainly believe it is. And we certainly thank you for all three of you for taking the time to help serve the good of public education on these topics. We really could not do it without you. Lindsey, Teel from U.S. Department of Labor, thank you so much.
Thanks, Ed.
Alex Hutkin from Securing America's Future Energy. Alex, thank you.
Thanks, Ed. Really appreciate it.
And from Torc Robotics, Michael Fleming, thank you so much for spending some time with us.
Absolutely. Thanks for having me back again, Ed.
And to all of our audience, thank you for making the time to make automated vehicle education a part of your day. We really appreciate it. If you'd like to share this with others who weren't able to make it live, there will be a recording on YouTube shortly. The best way to find out about that is to follow us at PAVE Campaign on Twitter and LinkedIn and Instagram. Yeah, we will be back here in one more week with another fascinating conversation. And we certainly hope to see you then.